Welcome back to the channel, and today I'm taking a deep look into how desktop targeted hard disks compare to those that are specifically marketed for surveillance use. These surveillance hard disks come in at similar price points to desktop drives. They have a 3-year versus a 2-year warranty on the desktop units, and typically they also have higher workload ratings, and actually they even have mean time between failure statistics stated where the desktop drives often don't. So the reason I'm doing this is because I want to find out if they're stated fit for surveillance use. Also means that they're a good or bad pick for the desktop. And this is important because I previously compared all the major desktop hard drives for performance, and I'm going to link that video down below, but the biggest takeaway from this was that many of the desktop drives actually use this Shingled Magnetic Recording technology, often without really being clear in their statement of that use, and these drives actually have a horrible write performance in common scenarios, and I was left with a feeling that there is actually very little good choice in the desktop hard disk market, so maybe these surveillance drives can help. And if you're not familiar with SMR or CMR based hard disk technologies, go and check my videos on the channel that cover this. Again, I'm going to link those below, but the important thing to know is that you should avoid buying SMR based drives for nearly all scenarios. So in this video, I'm going to do a few things. Firstly, I'm going to compare desktop and surveillance drives from Seagate, Western Digital and Toshiba for performance on various types of workloads, and this includes large and mixed file writes, large and mixed file reads, and extensive file rewrites. Secondly, I'm going to look at the power draw and the noise levels, and also look at the current pricing. And thirdly, we're going to see which manufacturers are actually using SMR drives for their surveillance as well as their desktop drives, and importantly, which drives you should just avoid. I'm going to pick my preferred options, and I'm going to provide some links below to those drives that I would go for. There are for sure a number of drives in this collection today that I wouldn't buy. And just to address the elephant in the room, because there's always going to be someone here in the comments that says, oh, a hard drive's still a thing. I've been using SSDs for years. Yes, I get it. I use SSDs for all my boot drives and high performance storage, but hard drives are superior for mass storage and nearline storage due to the data resilience, the price per terabyte, and pure storage capacity. Go compare the price of an 8TB hard disk to an 8TB NVMe, and maybe see if you can even buy an SSD above that size without having to sell off all your internal organs. People do still buy hard disks. In fact, as Blocks and Files reported, 2024 Q1 sales of hard disks were around 30 million units, and that's about 279 exabytes of storage. And that capacity growth here is actually growing faster than SSDs. Now, yes, this is mostly driven by data center storage, but these principles do extend to home and enthusiast use cases. And for example, NAS devices are getting increasingly popular for home and small businesses. And then there's technology such as heat-assisted magnetic recording and continued increases in areal density and platter counts, and these are growing storage density quickly. So you can also go check my video on the hammer technology. I'll also link that below. Okay, so let's kick this off first with the performance testing results. And this sets the scene for the other test and the price comparison. Even though I would use SSDs for high performance use cases, you still don't want your mass storage and backup speeds to suck. All drives here are 2TB models, so it's like for like across the range. And these test results are averaged over at least 5 exact copies of each test. Writes especially can be a bit lumpy, and this smooths the results a bit and helps identify, if there's any external factors that could be impacting the testing. Drives do vary across the capacity range, but up to around 8TB, the disk technology does remain fairly similar. So this data you're seeing here is representative for that kind of lower end between 2 and maybe 6 to 8TB of capacity. And I also have more content on large capacity disks. You can go and check all that out. There are 2 drives I performed all the tests on, but I didn't include in the test data as they appear to be inferior to every other drive here in every way. So the Toshiba P300 HD WD220 isn't here. Now that's a 5400 RPM SMR drive that performs worse than the 7200 RPM HD WD320 version. Also, there's a WD Blue WD20 EZ-AZ. Again, it isn't here. Again, it's a 5400 RPM SMR drive, and its performance is eclipsed by both the WD20 EZ-BX 7200 RPM SMR drive and also the WD20 ERAZ, which is a 5400 RPM CMR version of the drive. And if you do want to see how those compare, you can go check my video on the desktop comparisons. They're in there, but in my opinion, you should never buy either of these drives. I will explain all the test data as we go, but feel free to pause or re-watch a section if you need to. Broadly speaking, in the charts, the WD Blue drives are coloured blue, the WD Purple is purple, The Toshiba drives are in red colours, the Seagate Barracuda I've coloured green, and the Seagate Skyhawk surveillance drives is in yellow. I have tried to make this as clear as possible, but there's quite a lot of data here to convey. Okay, so first up, we're going to run a large file write test. And in this test, we write 10 gigabytes of data to each of the disks sequentially until the disk is 99% full. The Toshiba S300 HDWT7T720 surveillance drive stands out here as by far the worst. In my last group test, I hated the Toshiba P300 drives more than any other. They're SMR, but also their SMR implementation seems to be inferior, and it produces poor performance in many tests. It's fair to say that none of the surveillance drives here stand out in the large file write test, with the WD Purple and the Seagate Skyhawk also not impressing, but overall the Skyhawk is closer to the desktop drives in the test. And to be fair, surveillance drives are not tuned to this type of workload, so it isn't a big surprise. The highest performance drive in this test is actually the 7200 RPM WD Blue SMR drive, with the WD Blue 5400 CMR, the Barracuda 7200 RPM SMR drive, and then the Toshiba P300 drive all performing fairly similarly. This use case is not one that SMR usually struggles with, as these are large files in sequential writes into an empty disk. Now if we exclude all the SMR drives from the test data just to declutter this a bit, it leaves us with the WD Blue CMR, the WD Purple and the Seagate Skyhawk. And we can see that the performance is similar, but the Purple doesn't do quite as well, as it has a lower write performance just around the middle of the disk. And if we look now at the time to completion data for this test, this is the time taken to write the entire disk with 10 gigabyte files. It's clear that the 72 RPM drives perform best, and the SMR doesn't have a major impact, though the WD CMR 5400 RPM drive really isn't far behind them. The Toshiba S300 does look particularly poor. Next we look at large read performance, and in this test we read back the full disk again, 10 gig at a time, measuring the time and the speed for each test. These retests typically produce much more consistent results, and it gives a clear picture of the data transfer speeds available at all parts of the disk. The drop-off we see on all units is expected, and it's caused by a lower data density on the inner portion of the disk. It's only possible to store around 50% of the data on the inner tracks as the outer ones, and this is just due to the circular nature of the disk platters. So here we see that the drives are really grouped into two clusters. All the surveillance drives start at around 200 megabytes per second at the outer tracks, and they drop to around 90 megabytes per second at 99% capacity. The Toshiba drives always seem to exhibit this kind of undulation in performance, and this is true of the S300 as well as the P300 desktop drive. The rest of the disks are clustered up around 15% higher. Interestingly, the disks at the top are all 7200 RPM SMR disks, except for the WD Blue 5400 CMR drive. I saw before that there appears to be a general performance penalty for SMR even on reads, and this penalty is around 20%. Given that the 7200 RPM drives also then get a performance boost of about 25% just due to their high rotational speed, these two things broadly cancel each other out. So it ends up that the WD Blue 5400 CMR ends up with similar performance to those 7200 RPM disks. Overall, the Toshiba P300 7200 RPM SMR drive here has marginally the best performance. Now again, focusing only on the CMR drives, both the surveillance drives have similar performance and the Purple marginally behind the Skyhawk, but with the WD Blue drive performing better. Again, time to completion is similar to before, with the 7200 RPM SMR drives the fastest, then the WD Blue CMR drive, and then all of the three surveillance drives bringing up the rear. Next we look at the mixed file write test, and this again is a sequential write test of 10 gigabyte chunks of data. However, in this case, instead of being a single large file, it's 5,500 files of various sizes in each test subject. The Toshiba and Barracuda SMR drives do not fare well here. The S300 suffers a near immediate collapse in performance to only around 40 megabytes per second, and it slowly declines then to about 30 megabytes per second at 99%. The Barracuda doesn't do much better. It appears to have a larger persistent cache, so it is able to write around 180 gigs of data before its performance falls to similar to that of the 300. And if anyone's used a Seagate external backup disk and experienced long times to write backups to it, it's because those typically have Barracudas inside, and this is how they tend to perform. The Toshiba P300 desktop 7200 RPM SMR drive also performs badly with an early drop in write speed, but it does hold up a little better than the S300. The P354 drive I tested previously did behave more like the S300, so it's not a prize due to the similar rotational speeds. All the CMR surveillance disks perform very similarly here, with the Seagate Skyhawk and the WD Blue doing a little better than the WD Purple. The standout performer here is actually the WD Blue 7200 RPM SMR drive. So the WD implementation of SMR appears to be far better than the others, and it doesn't suffer from poor performance on these sequential writes, at least in all the tests that I've done. I also believe the reason it gains an advantage over the CMR drives here is just the faster rotational speed. This reduces access latency and allows the drive to manage the drive metadata updates required for large numbers of file writes and enables to do this faster. This metadata was usually held in a specific part of the disk, so the heads do have to seek back and forth to do this. The time to completion graph here tells the story clearly, with the Toshiba and Barracuda drives taking at least 3 times as long to complete the test as the CMR drives. The WD20EZBX drive doesn't have this problem, despite being SMR like the others, and actually it's the fastest completion time here at just 3 hours and 39 minutes. Okay, so next let's move to the mixed read test, and again, the lowest performance drives are the surveillance drives. Again, these drives are optimized for write performance because in CCTV systems, you're likely writing many streams of data simultaneously, but you're only really reading data occasionally when you either want to review footage or back it up. Now the Seagate Skyhawk does do a little better than WD Purple and the Toshiba S300. Interestingly, the WD Blue 7200 RPM drive doesn't do anywhere near as well here for reads as it did for writes. And this isn't really what I expected, but this test was run 10 times and the results were really consistent. I had previously tested this drive with write cache disabled, and this seems to produce better results. But in this case, all drives in the testing had all their write caches enabled. So the best performers here are the Toshiba P300 and the Seagate Barracuda, and they're both 7200 RPM SMR drives. And again, with a focus on the non-SMR drives for a minute, the Blue has a performance advantage with the Purple, and then a little behind the Skyhawk. Now the completion time graph shows that this rate is much closer, with around a 20% variance between the drives. Again, P300 and the Barracuda being the fastest, the S300 and the WD Purple the slowest, so the Toshiba S300 doesn't do as badly here, but it still doesn't do well. Lastly, performance test, we move to the mixed non-sequential rewrite test, and this test is where basically we rewrite 20% of all the files across the disk. So what this does is it creates a really bad case for SMR drives because it's going to result in a large number of SMR zone rewrites. And we can see here that all the SMR drives perform really poorly here, with all of them falling to between maybe 5 and 15 megabytes per second for the majority of the test. The 7200 RPM Blue SMR drive takes the longest to sync to this performance, but it does it around 20% of the way through the disk, with the Barracuda by around 10% of the disk, and the Toshiba drives the worst at between 3 and 5%. This kind of test reflects when you might be updating many documents or files on your disk, or when doing a partial backup, or when you're doing a backup of data that's overwriting previous versions, rather than doing a full clean of the hard disk and then copying again. And this is why, in my opinion, for most use cases, I would just never buy an SMR hard drive. If you're using these disks for RAID or ZFS, it's even worse, and the array builds can even fail, and drives can even get ejected from the array. The links I have below to drives won't include SMR drives. Please do avoid these and check the model numbers on drives you buy to check you're not getting one of these. I'm serious. Check the model numbers before you buy desktop and especially Toshiba drives in general. Okay, SMR aside and focusing on the non-shingled disks, the WD Blue 5400 RPM drive is the worst performing here of the CMR drives, with the WD Purple and the Seagate Skyhawk offering very similar performance and really making back the gains that the Blue seemed to have in the previous tests. And you can see from these results now that the surveillance drives really are tuned to this use case where the media streams are written and then cycled and overwritten. Firmware is going to arrange the cache and the write planning to optimize for this, and it's why you're likely not optimized quite so much for maybe large reads and the writes. And the final time to completion graph here just shows how large the performance gap is here for all of the SMR drives, with the test taking over 9 times as long in the worst case. The WD-SMR implementation does do better than others here, but it's still around 5 times slower than the CMR drives. Okay, so now let's look at the power draw for each of these drives. And bear in mind that these power draw tests are performed using a Sabrent USB enclosure, and that draws about 1.3 watts without the drive. And that 1.3 watts is included in the total power draw you're going to see for all these numbers. The numbers are taken at the wall, so there could be a little loss in the AC adapter, but it's going to be consistent across all tests. So overall, it isn't a surprise that the three 7200 RPM SMR drives draw the most and are all pretty comparable with the Toshiba P300, slightly better and more consistent than the others with a lower idle power draw. For the four 5400 RPM drives, the Toshiba S300 SMR actually does best, but it's also the worst performing drive in the performance tests. Between the WD Blue, Purple and the Seagate Skyhawk, the Seagate Surveillance drive is a little better. For example, the WD Blue disk draws around a watt more on the read tests, but there's no real difference on the write tests. So the blue and the purple drives here are very similar. The power draw figures are typically very consistent over the tests, and we're talking about variances of just typically maybe 0.1 watts. So next we're going to look at the decibels. So we're going to look at the noise these drives make. And testing was done here in a sealed acoustic box to minimize external interference, with the reading taken at just 5 centimeters for all the tests. So the consistent baseline inside the box is around 31 decibels. And again, the 7200 RPM drives, the left 3 bars here on the chart are generally louder on all tests than the 5400 RPM drives, which is not really a surprise. The WD Blue SMR 7200 drive is generally quieter than the Barracuda and the Tosh P300, and the 5400 RPM Toshiba S300 surveillance drive doesn't actually do too well either, typically louder than the 5400 RPM drives, which you can see here in the 3 right-hand bars on each test. Of the CMR drives, there isn't really a lot in it, to be honest, though the WD Blue seems a little bit noisier for mixed file reads. These values are peak, however, and if we look at the steady state readings, the story is similar, but the WD Blue seems to be consistently the quieter of the drives, with the Skyhawk a little louder than the purple. None of these drives are particularly noisy compared to, say, enterprise drives, which can be in the higher 40s, but the 5400 RPM drives are definitely the quieter. So cache cleaning is quite a noisy operation, and this is the process where SMR drives use to kind of rearrange data during idle time. So this can make the SMR drives quite noisy, even when your computer is telling you that the disk isn't doing anything at all. Okay, and finally, let's look at prices. I looked at a number of retailers in the US, UK and Germany, and although not all these drives are currently available at every retailer, there is enough coverage to get a good idea on the pricing. The caveat here is that obviously pricing varies, and it's common to see offers but also higher prices when stock is low. Also, you should consider that Amazon and Newegg both have marketplace sellers, and when they don't have stock themselves, you may see pricing via third parties, and which I probably wouldn't buy from, to be honest. Simply because buying from authorized sellers is often needed to actually get warranty coverage from the manufacturer. Amazon themselves are authorized sellers for all of these vendors. Their marketplace sellers, may or may not be. You'd have to do your research. Generally, the desktop drives from Seagate and WD are competitive, within a few dollars, pounds or euros. The key thing here is that you likely don't need to pay a premium to get the WD Blue CMR drive, and you can avoid the SMR options. Now, Toshiba drives are often not readily available, and pricing can actually be typically higher for these. They're also all SMR. For the surveillance drives, you may pay, say, a 10% premium or so, but not always. And in fact, Amazon UK in this case has the Seagate Skyhawk as one of the cheapest options, with the purple only £3 behind it. On Amazon US, the purple does seem a little more expensive than the Seagate and WD desktop drives, but again, we're talking about less than 10%. And do remember those surveillance drives come with a 3-year warranty compared to just 2 years on the desktop units. Pricing is also similar across the range in Amazon Germany and the UK as well, actually, which had the most choice at least on March 31st, 2025. It does vary daily though, so your mileage may vary. So in summary there, pricing is variable, but it's generally comparable, and it's not going to be the biggest factor here most often, if I'm honest. Availability and current offers do impact the price the most, so if the drives are comparable in other areas, you should go and pick up the best deals. And on that note, having done the testing, compared the prices, let's go to the conclusions and where and when I would buy these drives. But before we do that, do please like this video if it was useful, interesting, or if you appreciate the content. These likes actually make a really big difference to getting my work in front of others. So please share your comments. And also, please do consider a subscribe if you want to see more. I'm currently finishing up testing on a range of NAS drives, and that video is going to be coming shortly. So I've also posted some affiliate links below to the drives you would pick up also, And using those links also supports the work I do here without any cost to you. This helps me buy those SMR drives to test so that you don't have to. So thanks a million for your support. Okay, conclusions. Right, the number one takeaway, I would just avoid the SMR drives. In some cases, they're a little worse, and in many cases, the performance is just terrible. If you plan to write some of these drives more than once, and you don't want it to take forever, just stick with the CMR drives. Again, I have a video that explains all this. The second thing is that for these lower end drives, I would avoid personally a Toshiba. Not only are they the only manufacturer here to use SMR in their desktop and their surveillance drives, but their SMR implementation seems to be the worst, doesn't even support trim. And this means that even after deleting all content from the disk and deleting and recreating a partition, the disks can actually take hours to complete their cache cleaning and work, and for the disk to be back to its baseline performance. I do plan on testing Toshiba's higher end drives, especially their data center drives, as people do say good things about them. But these lower end drives, they don't seem great. Next up, if you do want to buy Seagate, I would avoid the Barracuda drive. They're SMR up to around 8 terabytes in capacity, and I would go with the Surveillance Skyhawk. So they state that the Skyhawk are all CMR on their website, as you can see here, and they do perform way better than Barracuda in some important tests. But you do still have to be careful though. So I tested the ST2000 VX017, and we can see from the datasheet, which is listed below, that this is a CMR drive, but it does look like there are SMR drive versions lurking, like the ST2000 VX015 we see here. So they do claim the same performance, but they only state the maximum number anyway, so we know how this goes in reality. So there are some cases where large file reads and writes, and with mixed writes, where the 7200 RPM SMR Barracuda does perform better than the tested Skyhawk. But the mixed read performance, and especially the rewrite performance, are poor if you're copying any quantity of data due to the fact that the Barracudas are SMR. So I believe personally that Seagate are not doing a good job with transparency on the Barracuda's use of SMR, and it is actually one of the most popular desktop drives out there. And from what we saw on the datasheet with the SMR Skyhawk, which also contradicts their website on the model being CMR, there is also a problem here for me. So I would imagine similar or worse performance on an SMR Skyhawk at 5400 RPM. As for the WD, their SMR implementation does seem the best, with the 7200 RPM WD20 EZBX drive generally performing well compared to the Barracuda P300 and S300. But it still suffers on the rewrite test, and mostly the 5400 RPM CMR WD20 EARZ is a better drive. That consumes less power, makes less noise, and typically for the same price or even cheaper. The purple is also a good pick, but performs a bit worse for read-write performance, but it's a good chunk better on the rewrite test. So I think that the WD Blue CMR, the WD Purple and the Seagate Skyhawk are the best picks here. Choose the one that you can get at the best price, and the surveillance models also come with that 3 years warranty, right, opposed to the 2-year on the desktop, so that could also offset some of the small price difference. Okay, I also realised that all the part numbers and the nuance here between CMR and SMR versions, that it's all a bit of a word salad. So I hope this helped, and thank you for bearing with me with that. And again, I want to thank you all for watching to the end, and I will see you in the next.